Johnny Rocket Launchpad. And now, here's Johnny.
Hey, it's Johnny Rocket here at the Johnny Rocket Launchpad, launching ideas in your direction, the Northwest's only rock and roll libertarian radio show. I'm here with my co-host, Mr. Kurt Nelson. Bam! My voice of reason, the beautiful and sexy Heather Nixon. Brown chicken, brown cow!
You want to go to Uniqlo?
Yeah, we'll go.
Brown chicken,
brown cow.
Yeah, I see what you did there.
It'd be brown chicken, brown horse.
Right.
Right on. Anyways, though, we have Professor Kevin Gutzman.
Man, what a wealth of knowledge.
Wealth of knowledge.
Man.
Again, for those just tuning in, New York Times bestselling author of 4 books, and he's a professor of history at the Western Connecticut State University. And you can check out his website at kevingutzman.com, and his last name is spelled Gutzman. So kevingutzman.com. Check him out. He has some awesome material for sale, and you can also check out Kevin Gutzman. Once we get this episode published, we'll have his books on the JohnnyRocketLaunchpad.com. Professor Gutzman, who was your favorite first lady?
Oh, boy. Well, C-SPAN and Siena College did a poll of scholars on this question, I guess about a year and a half ago, and I was one of the people they asked. Mm-hmm. And they wanted actually for us to rate each of the first ladies on 5 criteria. So we were supposed to rate them 1 to 5 on each of 5 accounts, I think. And after I did this, I got to the end of their little questionnaire, and then they said, "Is there anything else you'd like to tell us?" And I said, "Yes, I think that this office of First Lady should be abolished. It's totally un-Republican. Nobody elected these people. It's offensive that we have this institution that looks like, a queen consort in England or something. It's really entirely contrary to our constitutional system that just being married to Obama means you get to have millions of dollars. You get to have a staff with a chief of staff and a press secretary and 2 or 3 secretaries and several policy aides, and you can go out and have a drink water tour or heckle people about make that up.
It's rock star, man. It's rock star.
You can go out and have hectoring kids about what they should eat in cafeterias all over the country. And it's asinine.
It's stupid.
That's a nicer way to say it. And it's just offensive, and it really shouldn't exist. So,
right.
I think if I had to choose a first lady, well, the joke is I like Mrs. Buchanan because Buchanan was never married. Also, Jefferson was a widower when he took office. He had a good first lady. And actually, in our lifetime, geez, they've all just been so obnoxious, starting with Mrs. Carter and then Mrs. Reagan. Mrs. Carter decided she actually wanted to attend cabinet meetings. That was ridiculous. And then Mrs. Reagan had her astrologer deciding what the president's travel schedule would be.
Oh my God, this is funny. This is funny.
Yeah, and actually, I've heard people seriously talking recently about the idea that Michelle Obama should run for president. And what are her qualifications? Well, she's been married to the president.
Oh,
that's
my God.
That's just shoot me now.
Right? No, I'm with you.
Honestly.
Oh man.
So
yeah, she's all into like kids' schools lunches, and they can't have fat food anymore, and she wants to ban fried foods and the short line, and she wants everything to be healthy and getting rid of soda machines.
Yeah, and meanwhile, her kids are going to Sidwell Friends, and they're having caviar for lunch.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, and then it is just this ridiculous movement of feminism that think that it's not good enough just to be the wife of the president and be a great hostess and be gracious, and I have to have power. Well, whatever. Kiss my ass.
Yeah, the White House is a nice crib. Suck it up.
That's right.
You got a lot to decorate.
Right.
Right. And if you're
you better start working.
And if you're going to influence policy, then do it behind closed doors like they used to do back in the day.
It was called pillow talk. You know what I was thinking, honey? If you want some of this, you might want to do this.
Right, yeah.
I don't know.
There is an issue with these school lunches, so...
You're right.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know. Okay, next question. Progressive left. We're all getting off track.
Okay,
Sorry, Professor.
All right, sorry.
Progressive left and right have expanded. Now, I'm not just saying the left, because a lot of times a lot of people think it's left. It's also right. The right have expanded their constitutional power. How do they go about achieving this, though, in your opinion?
essentially what's happened is that over time, the federal courts have decided to go along with congressional claims of authority. So really, again, as I said in an earlier segment, this goes back to the 1930s when the old majority of Supreme Court justices who had voted the first round of New Deal legislation unconstitutional were replaced by cronies of Franklin Roosevelt, people he appointed just because he knew they would say that whatever he wanted to do was constitutional. And now their idea is essentially, basically whatever left-wing policy comes out of Congress is constitutional. In fact, they think it's a principle that they should defer to Congress. Well, of course, the Constitution doesn't say anything about deferring to Congress. The federal courts are only supposed to enforce constitutional laws. So if Congress passes one that's not constitutional, it's a violation of a federal judge's oath to enforce a law that's not constitutional. And yet here we have this system. So, there's actually, if you go to the American Conservative Magazine's website, you can find a review I wrote of a book by Justice Stephen Breyer about, the subtitle is Making Our Democracy Work. And his idea is that the federal courts ought to be in the business of trying to help implement left-wing policies. Well, that's not what the Constitution says. That's not the purpose for which federal courts were created. They're supposed to be about protecting our rights, one of which is to have only the government the Constitution established. So, essentially, the whole system is corrupted by people who have decided they're just going to ignore the Constitution.
Right. It's a living, breathing document, man.
Right. A living, breathing document, of course, means it's dead. Right? Exactly the opposite. I'm not even kidding, because, a written Constitution only has one purpose. The only thing it's supposed to do is limit the power of government, right? You could have a chief executive, you could have a bicameral legislature, you could have a judicial system without a written Constitution. You don't need a written Constitution to have a Bill of Rights. England has all of these things, right? They don't have a written Constitution. The reason we have a written Constitution, and here's the interesting part, make all these people swear an oath to uphold it, is because it's supposed to limit what they can do.
Right. It's not.
And yet that's the one thing it doesn't do. It does not do that.
Right.
So, Tom Woods and I co-authored a book called Who Killed the Constitution? And it's basically about the current situation we have in which there's consensus among the three branches of the federal government. They can just do whatever they want, It's crazy. And then you have people who've worked for presidents who, once they leave whatever position they've been in the executive branch, they then go out and write books about the wonderful policy or the wonderful principle of unlimited presidential authority. I mean, there's this professor named John Yoo at the University of California.
I was going to ask you a question about John Yoo.
He is the worst kind of lick-spittle, sycophant of
lick spittle. Isn't that a good thing?
Yeah. Well, I guess it depends on the context, but I didn't mean it to be a good thing. Yeah, of course, I am talking about California. So, but his argument in his latest book, or actually not the current one, but the one before that, was, well, everything George W. Bush did was constitutional because, look, there are precedents for it in Abraham Lincoln's administration. So anything Lincoln did, that's kind of the baseline. Well, let's think about that. What did Lincoln do? Well, he expelled a politician from the country for criticizing him. He closed 300 plus newspapers for criticizing him. He jailed thousands of political prisoners for criticizing him. He had the army have elections in the districts they were stationed in, and then have the people they elected representing Tennessee in Congress. Tennessee was a Confederate. I mean, I could name 15 more things he did. And Yu's argument is, well, Lincoln did what he had to do, and W didn't do anything Lincoln didn't do.
Right.
So everything's great.
Right. It's all good.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. It's all good. So, and anything Lincoln didn't do, you could find precedent for in whatever Franklin Roosevelt did.
Right.
So essentially, if you've had two or three tyrants, if you've had two or three presidents who acted as if they had unlimited authority, who ignored the idea of limited authority, which is what the Greek word that's the root of our word tyrant doesn't mean a bad ruler. It means a ruler who ruled without the Constitution.
Right.
And we've had several presidents like, the current guy. What does he do? He actually made this is really cheeky. This is just brash. He actually decided he was tired of waiting for the Senate to confirm some of his nominees. So he just declared that the Senate was in recess, and then he declared he was making recess appointments. Well, the Senate wasn't in recess.
Right.
Everybody knew it.
Right.
But the thing was, it took a year for the courts to get around to saying, yeah, you can't do that. And meanwhile, these dudes they'd issued all kinds of regulations, basically because our administrative agencies can actually make law, which of course is unconstitutional, but that doesn't stop anybody in Washington. So my point is that this is the lack of system we have. Basically, everybody knew that what Obama was doing was perfectly unconstitutional, and yet
they don't care.
He goes ahead and he does it. The media act as if, well, this is an issue. On one side, we have the Democrats saying he can do it. On the other hand, we have the Republicans saying he can't do it. Really?
Right.
And there's no truth?
Right.
Isn't there? Could you just pick it up and read it and see that it says he can make recess appointments when the Senate is in recess?
You're right.
I mean, seriously, there's a word recess. What does that mean?
Right.
So,
Well, it meant to me is like playtime. When I was a kid, it's recess. It's
Well, the point is, if you're in math class, you're not in recess.
Right.
If the Senate is meeting down the street, that means it's not in recess.
Right.
And so Obama just declares it in recess and makes some recess appointments.
Yeah, that's
you
crazy.
just can't think of any prohibition that the Constitution includes that they haven't just decided we're going to ignore. Because we feel like it.
Right.
So, Professor, the executive power, let's talk about executive orders. What is the origin of that? How did they come about, and how did they become so out of control?
How did who become so out of control?
Yeah, the president's doing executive orders, just declaring legislation because I'm president.
Well, yeah, that's a lot of conservatives.
Let's open up a can of worms.
Yeah, a lot of conservatives think that executive orders ought to be banned, right? These are just bad, and they do nasty things by executive order, and so we shouldn't have executive orders. The problem there is that, of course, the president is the chief executive. In theory, the executive branch reflects him. And in theory, he can make an executive order. He's just telling his subordinates what to do. So it's not the fact of executive orders that's the problem. It's the legislation by executive order. So the ones that are problematic are the ones where the president just announces from now on the law is going to be what it isn't, saying the Senate's in recess when it's not. So when he does things like that, when he issues an executive order that says, for example, well, if you're one of the 5 million Mexicans who are living in the country illegally, we're just going to declare that we're not deporting you, and we're going to give you a Social Security card, and we're going to sign you up for this and that benefit, and the IRS is going to give you 3 years of tax refunds that you haven't received and all kinds of stuff. Well, what he's done is he's changed the law. So that is not an executive order, properly speaking. That's actually a legislative act. And there he's just arrogated the power of Congress to make legislation to himself. So the issue is within the executive branch, the idea, and this is one, of course, we saw George W. Bush doing this a lot too, the idea that the president can just say, well, I'm making an order that the law will be the opposite. Another thing that W did a lot of was he would issue these signing statements where he would sign a bill into law. Say it has 3 parts, right? He would say, well, I'm signing this into law, but you realize that part 2, I'm not going to enforce. That's unconstitutional, so that's not law. Really? Because the Constitution says you can sign it or you can veto it. It doesn't say you can strike out part of it you don't like. Actually, the most absurd example of him doing this was one time when George W. Bush was president, he got a military appropriation bill. And it had a provision that said, we're going to have this money for these kinds of weapons and this kind of helicopters and so on. And then at the end of that section, it said, and none of this money can be spent for offensive military operations in Colombia. In other words, the Congress did not want the president to go get involved in the drug conflict that was going on in the South American country of Colombia.
Right.
When George W. Bush signed this bill into law, he said, I'm going to take that section as advisory.
We're just going to make shit up. We're going to make
take
shit
that
up.
as meaning Congress is telling me what they would like me not
Right.
to do, but I'm not going to accept that it's actually law that I can't do it.
Right.
So he's, on one hand, he's going to take the money that section says he's going to get to buy all these kinds of weapons and so on.
Right.
But on the other hand, he's going to pretend that it doesn't exist, a prohibition on him spending it in particular ways. And actually, when Obama was running for president, he said, this needs to stop. And he actually, in several different speeches, he said, these signing statements from President George W. Bush, they're just unconstitutional. He's acting as if he were the Congress. But within a week of taking office, Obama did the same thing.
Am I correct to understand that executive orders should be limited to the executive branch? They shouldn't expand beyond that, or am I wrong?
Well, the issue isn't the executive branch. Again, when President Obama decided to change the immigration law just by saying, I'm going to change the immigration law, in other words, not by going to Congress and saying, here's what I'd like the law to be, and having them pass a bill and him sign it, which is the way you're supposed to change the law.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, he just announced, well, if you're one of these 5 million Mexican kids and, Guatemalans, whatever, if you're one of these 5 million people who are under age 18, and I'm going to exempt you from these requirements in the law that you go back to your home country, and instead of fining you, I'm going to sign you up for Social Security, and we're going to give you the advantages of Obamacare, and we're going to give you back tax refunds and so on. The problem there was not that he was telling the executive branch to do it. The problem was that he was making up a law. Mm-hmm. That he was acting like the legislature.
Right.
So,
it's not in his scope.
The president's job is to tell the other people in the executive branch what to do, but he's supposed to tell them to enforce the law, not to tell them to ignore the law and enforce something else,
right.
Which is what Obama has been doing even more than W. I mean, we actually, if somebody asked you, who are the worst 5 presidents in American history, 2 of them have been the last 2. Right. It's just astounding. You think we've had some real suckers, man, but these 2 guys take the cake. They're just awful. So
right on.
In a lot of ways, Obama has been a continuation of the George W. Bush administration.
Right on. Hey, we have a question from one of our listeners. His name is Rob Stratton, and his question to you, Professor, is the Constitution guarantees a Republican form of government. But does that mean the Union can kick a state out if they don't have a Republican form of government?
Well, that's an interesting question. Actually, the reason for that provision in the Constitution is that right before the Philadelphia Convention that wrote the Constitution met in 1787, in 1786, there had been an event in Massachusetts called Shays' Rebellion. Mm-hmm. And Shays' Rebellion was a very large-scale tax revolt in western Massachusetts where you had for a long time, historians used to say, well, this was disgruntled poor people who didn't want to pay their taxes. But studies of this event in the last couple of decades have shown, no, it wasn't disgruntled poor people. In fact, one of the county colonels of militia was one of the participants. Now, in the old days when there were militias, those were amateur people who were trained to be soldiers, mm-hmm. and the colonel was the head of the militia in a county. So in other words, if you had the militia colonel participating in Shays' Rebellion, that means the whole society was involved. That's the richest guy in the county participating in Shays' Rebellion. Okay. So what happened was essentially that people in western Massachusetts decided they didn't like a new tax law, which really was an onerous tax law. And they didn't like the requirement that taxes be paid in gold and silver. And so they were going to keep the Massachusetts government, which is in Boston on the East Coast, they're going to keep them from enforcing it. And so the people who wrote the U.S. Constitution decided, well, if we have a future event where there's a revolt in one of our states and local people in some small part of a state have decided they're not going to let the valid laws of that state be enforced, Congress should be able to intervene on the side of the legitimate authorities and help them to enforce their policies. Mm-hmm. And so we shouldn't have anything like Shays' Rebellion again without having the federal government be able to step in and say, we're not going to allow that to happen.
Mm-hmm. Right on. Hey, really quick before we wrap up this second segment here, what is your opinion on the Baltimore riots? Let's just
subject change.
There's got to be like a record scratch right there. Yeah. No, we have to wrap this up, so I didn't want to get into something too philosophical, but just your general opinion, maybe giving 2 minutes on this.
It seems to me that essentially over the last 30, 40 years, what's happened is the federal government has created these policies that essentially require people not to have jobs, not to have marriages. If you have kids, I understand that in Baltimore, you can have more, and in Maryland in general, you can have more public support if you have 3 children than if you have 2. And of course, the federal policy is that you don't want to have the father in the household, or at least if you're married to the father, then you're apt to lose your support too. So essentially, the government is telling people, don't stop with 1 child or 2, have 3 kids. Be sure you're not married. And then if you were to find work, you could meet an income threshold that would cut off your support. Beside which, we also have minimum wage laws and various other kinds of labor regulations that make it expensive to employ people. So we end up with people who are stuck in these neighborhoods. Oh, and they also have the worst school. Some of the worst schools in the country are.
And then there's zoning laws on top of that.
Yeah. So essentially, the government says we're going to make it illegal to hire you for the amount of money you're worth paying. We're going to require you to have more children. We're going to insist that you not marry the father. And if you do any of the opposite of what I just said, then you lose your federal and state support. Well, being poor doesn't mean you're stupid. If you know you get more money for having 1 more kid, you're going to have 1 more kid, right? No, totally. If you know you get more money by not marrying the father, then a lot of people are not going to marry the father, and so on. So you end up with many households where there's no man around, and you have young men, boys, and then young men who are growing up with mom. She's got no husband, and then she's at work all the time because she's poor, or if she can find work or whatever she's doing. So the whole thing is just kind of tailor-made for the same situation to be repeated generation after generation. And then yet they want more. Yeah, go ahead. And another thing you can do is you can make money without losing these benefits, but that money has to be made illegally. So if, say, you were going to go out and sell crack, as long as you don't report your income, then you can make money. Yeah, you can make money doing that. And if you don't report your income, then you don't lose any of those benefits. And so people end up involved in these kinds of, and meanwhile, the police, they know that a lot of these people are criminals. There's a lot of violence. So the cops are used to the people being violent. They don't trust the people in the neighborhoods that are most affected. I mean, it's just clearly the chief problem is the government giving people money for not working, telling them not to get married, telling them to have more kids.
It's all, and what makes me
minimum wage,
right? Yeah, what makes me upset? All these things were government influenced or government provided, and yet,
the thing about that, there's a classic book by one of my favorite writers, Charles Murray, called "Losing Ground: American Social Policy, 1950 to 1980." And I remember one of the graphs. I haven't read it in a while, but one of the graphs in that book shows that from the end of slavery until the 1960s, black men had a higher labor force participation rate than white men. That is, more of them participated in working than white men by percentage. But the minute the Great Society programs were implemented in 1965, as soon as those were implemented, the black labor force participation rate just plummeted. It just went way down. And so that's where we still are. It's much, much lower, and you have much, much more crime in these neighborhoods and so on. Again, criminality, actually also another thing is one of the first things that happened when American slavery ended was I'm a historian of the South, so I know about this. One of the first things that happened when American slavery ended was all over the South, white people wrote to each other. We have this from people all over the South saying the blacks were at the courthouses. And why do you think they would go to the courthouses as soon as slavery ended?
I don't know.
Because they could get married.
Oh, we're talking about marriage license.
You have
interesting.
You have throngs of people in South Carolina and Mississippi and Texas and Missouri, everywhere black people wanted to get married. And again, all the way down to the implementation of these current social payments for not being married and so on, black people were just as likely as white people to be married. But beginning in the 60s, you have this gigantic problem, and today it's over 75% of black kids are born out of wedlock. Wow. I mean, whatever you think of the moral issue, one of the best indicators that you're going to be poor for life is that you're born out of wedlock.
Right on. Anyway, so this is Johnny Rocket here at the Johnny Rocket Launchpad, launching ideas in your direction, the Northwest only rock and roll libertarian radio show. I'm here with my co-host, Mr. Kurt Nelson.
Yes, sir.
Voice of Reason, Miss Heather Nixon.
Yes.
And we are talking to Professor Kevin Gutzman. And we'll be right back. We have
Woman's Place.
Woman's Place. We'll be right back.